I am Camille Robcis. I teach in the History and French department at Columbia University, and I'm very happy to introduce this, I don't know what number we're at, but this webinar, the fall 2018 webinar on the question of memory in post-war France. So we have three really exciting papers to discuss today. I'm going to introduce our panelists briefly, and then I will give them the chance to tell us a little bit about their texts and situated them within the larger project, and then we'll open it up for questions. So if you guys, I think David already said, but if you have questions, you can either send them to me in writing and I will call, or I can read them, or you can raise your hand with that little hand and I will call on you and you can ask the questions directly. So we're going to do this chronologically. So we're going to start with Emma Kuby, who is Assistant Professor of History at Northern Illinois University. Emma received her PhD from Cornell University, and we're reading the introduction from her book, which is forthcoming when, Emma? Like soon, right?
In March.
In March.
March.
In March, and the title of the book is Political Survivors, the Resistance, the Cold War, and the Fight Against Concentration Camps After 1945, and it will be published by Cornell University Press. After Emma, we're going to go to Sandrine. So Sandrine Sanos, who is Associate Professor of Modern European History at Texas A&M University. Sandrine received her PhD from Rutgers University, and she is the author of a first book called The Aesthetics of Hate, Far-Right Intellectuals, Anti-Semitism, and Gender in 1930s France, which was published by Stanford in 2012. She's also the author of an intellectual biography of Simone de Beauvoir, which was published in 2016 by Oxford University Press. And she's currently working on two books. The first one is on a history of post-war French feminist thought, tentatively titled Feminist Troubles. And the second one is basically the project that we're going to be discussing today, which is currently called The Horror of History, Violence, Exile, and Gender in Cold War France. And finally, we're going to end with Claire Elridge, who is Associate Professor in Modern History at the University of Leeds. Claire has her PhD in modern history from the University of St. Andrews, and she joined Leeds in 2015. And we are also reading the introduction to her forthcoming book, and I don't know when it's coming out, yours, or is it out already? It
came out.
Okay, that's right. So recently appeared book, From Empire to, that's right, of course, because it's not the proofs anymore, sorry. From Empire to Exile, History and Memory Within the Pied Noir Anarchy Community, 1962 to 2012. So I'm really glad that the three of them are here today. I thought the pieces were all really fascinating and really challenged some of the assumptions we had about history and memory. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion with the three of them. So Emma, do you want to start us off and by telling us a little bit about the project and situating the introduction and how you came about this book and more generally?
Sure, absolutely. And just tell me if anything's off with the volume or whatever.
Yeah, it's looking good.
So, okay, so thank you, Camille, and thank you, David, for putting together this session. I'm really excited about this. As Camille said, I've given you all the introduction to my book, Political Survivors, which is out with Cornell in March. So I wanted to thank you all for reading Uncorrected Proofs and to thank Cornell University Press for letting me share them ahead of publication. So the book, as you've seen, is about it's about concentration camp survivors' political activism in the immediate post-war period, and especially the 1950s. What I've done in the book is unearth the history of a French-led international collective of former resistance deportees to the Nazi camps, the International Commission Against the Concentration Camp Regime, or by its French acronym, which I'll use from here on, CICRC. The CICRC was founded by French intellectual and Buchenwald and Neuengamme survivor David Rousset. It was led by him alongside a number of other prominent French survivors, including well-known ethnographer Germaine Tillon. The group claimed that concentration camp-like forms of detention continued to exist in the post-war world, and they carried out investigations of dehumanizing internment conditions in a number of places over the course of the 1950s. The USSR, Franco-Spain, Greece, the People's Republic of China, as well as French Tunisia and French Algeria. Some of these were on-site investigations. Some of them were from a distance. But they were all carried out by the survivors themselves. They didn't kind of delegate this. They claimed that only survivors had the authority to do this sort of work. Now, because of the spotlight that it's shown on the Soviet Gulag, the CICRC became deeply entangled in the politics of the Cold War, and it was eventually funded by the CIA. This wasn't something that I knew at the start of my research. It was something that I gradually figured out once this was already a book I was writing. And I'm happy to talk in question and answer about what that realization process was like and how it changed pretty radically, like the nature of the book that I wrote. So the group was entangled in the Cold War, but because of many members' kind of fundamentally anti-colonialist politics, it also became deeply entangled with the collapse of European empires in this period, and in particular in France's war in Algeria. So what Political Survivors does is it traces the narrative arc of the group's life and death from the late 40s to the late 50s. And it shows how ultimately the conflict in Algeria destroyed the organization by undermining members' claims about the relationship between past and present and the authority of their own experience. So in excavating the history of this organization, which really has been largely forgotten, my goal hasn't just been to restore the group and its leaders to our narrative of the period, but more broadly to explore how memory of World War II's violence influenced Western European responses to ongoing violence in the post-war world. And then conversely, how contexts like the Cold War and decolonization reshaped the ways that Europeans remembered World War II's violence, destabilizing or delegitimizing certain uses of memory and entrenching other ones. So before I say anything else about those larger issues, I just want to quickly underline kind of one thing about the nature of this group. This is clear in the introduction, but just in case there are people participating who did not read. So the CICRC was diverse in all kinds of ways. Men and a really notable number of women led it. It was comprised of people who had been deported to camps, satellite camps, sub-commandos all over the continent. People ran the professional gamut, all different ages, very young people involved, quite aged people involved. They came from 7 different European countries. Aside from shared non-communism, they were quite politically diverse. So a group of people with many differences across them. But there was one way in which the organization was very deliberately and as a matter of formal policy, not diverse at all. All of them had originally been non-Jewish, political resistance deportees to the Nazi camps, as opposed to racial victims of deportation. So Jews, including Jewish Holocaust survivors, were really entangled in the CICRC's work, and I'm happy to talk some about that further on. They were intensely involved in its history, but despite those entanglements, they were not permitted to formally join as official members. Only people who had been deported for acts of resistance or political opposition. So the intro explains all that, as I said. What I thought that I would just do quickly here, since our subject is memory, is to try to lay out maybe a little bit more explicitly than the introduction does, what interventions I think the book is trying to make about memory. And so I'll say 4 things, and then I will pass the baton to the next person here. First, the book is aiming to answer, I think, a pretty simple question about how Westerners, especially the French, remembered Nazi atrocity in the 15 years immediately following World War II. We now know from the work of a lot of people that the chief framework that they used to do so was not the Holocaust. So how did they think about Nazi evil, Nazi criminality, and what did they believe were its chief implications going forward? My book emphasizes that in this early period, the experience of resistance deportees was taken as the paradigmatic victim experience at Nazi hands. And so consequently, the ethical lessons that Europeans took away from World War II tended to be about ideologically and politically motivated violence and captivity, as opposed to lessons about racist extermination. And then the book explores, right, how A, the Cold War enforced this reading of the past for non-communists, and B, how the intensely racialized violence of decolonization undermined it. So second, the book aims to historicize the idea of bearing witness as the privileged response of survivors and moral third-party bystanders to remembered atrocity. I think that across various subfields, I'm thinking of human rights history, history of humanitarianism, French history, Holocaust studies, scholars have tended to treat witnessing as something that emerged as a valorized practice in the 60s or 70s, kind of coterminous with the rise of Holocaust consciousness in Europe. And so in this book, one thing that I do is I uncover this kind of very rich history of publicly celebrated victim witnessing in the immediate post-war years, with the witnesses in question as political concentration camp deportees rather than Jewish Holocaust victims. And I argue that these years were actually crucial years for what Annette Viviorca calls the advent of the witness in the post-war world, because during them, former resistors, very much including the people I write about, in essence managed to transfer the martial prestige of the resistance onto the act of bearing witness to extreme suffering. They used their moral authority as resistors to turn witnessing into a heroic act in its own right. Third, I think this might be a little bit counterintuitive given the CICRC's exclusion of Holocaust survivors. I'm actually aiming to contribute to the enormous literature on Holocaust memory as such. And in this sense, like Claire, I think I'm interested in replacing a discourse of absence or silence with something that's a little bit more nuanced. So the book looks at the ways in which the Jewish genocide haunted the post-war political imaginary, even as it remained marginal to the ways that Nazi violence was overtly memorialized in this period. And it looks at the ways that individual Jewish survivors who were involved in the CICRC, but not allowed to join it, navigated this terrain. Okay, fourth and final thing, and I'll be brief about this because the introduction does deal with this, but I'm interested in responding in concrete historical terms to some of the theoretical literature that praises putatively universalizing mobilizations of the memory of atrocity for present-oriented moral and political ends. Tsvetan Todorov, for example, writes admiringly about how my protagonists and other Nazi camp survivors universalized their experience to advocate for Soviet Gulag victims. Michael Rothberg, in Multidirectional Memory, writes about Nazi camp survivors identifying deeply with victims of French state violence during the Algerian War. And so one thing that my work on the CICRC suggests, unfortunately, this isn't something I'm thrilled about, is that matters are much more complicated than that. So within the history that I tell, universalizing mobilizations of memory turn out to be highly particularist and profoundly political. The past does not, in the end, map easily onto the present. It creates all sorts of problems to use it as a moral benchmark. Memory and the authority of victim experience turns out to be wielded to deny solidarity just as easily as to grant it. So in the end, I think the book is largely one about the perils of constructing moral universals on the basis of historically specific traumas. Now, the CICRC story is absolutely one about the political power of memory, right? I mean, this is an organization that is grounded in memory, that is fueled by memory. So that is true as well. But it's also ultimately a story about memory's fragility as a basis for an ethics or a politics of human solidarity. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Emma. Sandrine, do you want to go next?
Yes, I shall. Thank you. As you said, so the article I shared is part of this book I'm working on, tentatively titled The Horror of History, which I'm very much in the making. So I'll try and give a sense of it in broad terms. And the book is an intellectual and cultural history, and it explores how metropolitan French discussions regarding past war and violence, World War II, Nazism, but also Indochina, at a time of present and ongoing colonial and racial violence and war, obviously at a time of the Algerian War, but then later the Vietnam War, which preoccupied many in that time period, shaped the contours of what could be said, what could be imagined, and what could be heard in those years, specifically in this Cold War moment. So specifically how writers, artists, intellectuals, and filmmakers on the anti-colonial left or the new left, or who were themselves exiled or Holocaust survivors, theorized that violence, and how an idiom of gender and sex was central to how violated and injured bodies were talked about and signified who could be a political subject and what was political rather than a moral issue, as Emma talked about. So to put it differently, I was asking how paying attention to the sex of violence allows us to analyze how violence in broad terms was understood, talked about, and shaped Cold War France in both repressive and emancipatory ways. So to go back and explain how this book emerged, it came out of a number of historiographical questions. First, regarding our conventional periodization of post-war Europe, and especially for France, the post-war that wasn't a post-war, and of the decades between 45 and 68. Second, as someone who came to this work looking first at post-war Holocaust memory, I was interested in the ways in which scholarship on this question, which, as Emma said, is incredibly rich and varied, stood side by side with scholarship on the Algerian War in seemingly divorced conversation. So scholarship on the Algerian War, decolonization, or the Cold War, when in fact discussions and analogies regarding Nazism, the Holocaust as it unevenly emerged throughout the late 50s and 60s, but also Vichy, torture, camps, decolonization in the time of the Algerian War, were in fact contingent and entangled in complicated and unexpected ways. And this is where I think my work is in conversation with that of Emma and Claire. I mean, I think that original lack of engagement between these different historiographies has in fact been breaking down. Notably, I think that's what we read with Emma and Claire's work today, but also from the work of other historians like Phil Nord on the memory of deportation, or Catherine Brun on la guerre d'Algérie and its discourses. But at the same time, when I began working on this book, there was an increasing engagement and interest on post-war memory, specifically from literary scholars who were looking at texts where the question of the Holocaust and the Algerian War were entangled. So I'm thinking, of course, of the work of Michael Rothberg, and that all of three of us cite, and I think in part because we engage and critique his model of, or what he suggests about the productive nature of this cross-referencing and this multi-directional memories. But there are others like Deborah Chisanyal, Max Silverman in French studies, and beyond. So to me, while literary scholars pose the question of memory, looking at individual texts, I did not come to this project with memory as a category of analysis, nor as an object, even if it's evoked by the authors I look at, such as Marguerite Duras, which is the title of my article. But I was thinking in terms of discourse and representations of the political. So I was interested in the ways discussions and ideas in the press and cinema and literature were shaped in multiple political contexts, and their meanings were not stable. And how these contexts shape their circulation, reception, and their afterlife. So to trace these discussions, to see how they emerge from debates that were far from settled, and to see what was said and what could not be said. In fact, it meant problematizing the migrations of remembrance, as one literary scholar has called this, in order to interrogate not just the silences and the disavowals, but also the war of words that was going on at that time over the meaning of the Algerian War in a Cold War moment. And here I'd like to note that for me, as a historian of France, one of the most productive area of historiographical engagement has actually been with the field of post-45 Pacific and Southeast Asian history, transnational US history, in part because this is where questions of violence, its memory, and its politics have yielded really exciting work, and exciting historical work that poses similar questions in this manner. So to return to the article, Hiroshima was an obvious choice. Marguerite Duras and Alain René are authors, are some of the authors I look at, alongside with Edgar Morin, Albert Memmi, André Schwarzbach, Anna Langfuss, and others. And the film was made in 1959, forged in the crucible of the Algerian War by two figures who were committed anti-colonialists, and intent on working through the memory of World War II and deportation, but not as a Jewish experience. And the film evoked interesting question. It's a text about World War II in Asia. It's also a text that centers the figure of the tendu, and evoking questions of collaborations and complicity. But also because Hiroshima is usually taken to be a canonical aesthetic text that fictionalizes memory. We tend to think of René's 1955 Nuit et Brouillard on World War II, his 1963 Muriel on the Algerian War as political texts on memory. But Hiroshima somehow stands dehistoricized as a quasi-philosophical meditation. So to me, the question was, what takes place in reading the film when we historicize it, because then we see how these multiple historical contexts weighed in on the film's narrative and aesthetic choices, and even to the choice of the genre of the film, so its melodramatic love story. And it also meant taking seriously how gender and sexuality organized the film's meaning, and how it is in fact these gendered figures and a discourse about sex that remaps the political in the film. So I think it's, to me, this article on Hiroshima is exemplary of the kind of methodology I want to offer in this book, which is to thinking about the film historically in terms of its context shows how texts about past and present violence of war relied on the cultural labor of gender to signify who could be a subject of memory, of empathy, and, as I argue, of politics. But it also allows us to tease out the kinds of tensions and ambivalences that shaped particular political imaginaries, anti-colonial and others, invested in denouncing violence and war in this time period.
Great. Thank you, Sandrine. Claire?
Yes, okay. Can you hear me okay?
Good, thank you.
Good. Okay, so my book is a history of the commemorative afterlives of the Algerian War of Independence, which, as I'm sure you all know, lasted from 1954 until 1962 and brought to an end French colonial rule in Algeria. The war pitted the nationalist forces of the Front de Libération Nationale, or FLN, against the might of the French army. The Algerian War was one of the longest, but also the most violent of the wars of decolonization. And as a result of this violence, particularly the escalation of violence in the end stages of the war, as a result of this, in the summer of 1962, you saw mass migration of virtually the entire 1 million strong European settler population, more commonly known today as the Pieds Noirs, who felt compelled to leave the now independent Algeria and migrate to France. And they were joined by approximately 60,000 Harki, which is the name given to Muslim Algerians who, for various reasons, ended up serving with the French, and as a result of that service, were subjected to some extremely brutal revenge violence at the end of the conflict by the victorious FLN. And so what my book does is basically trace the experiences of these two communities after they arrived in France, and focuses on the different ways in which they mobilized to construct, to preserve, and also to disseminate their collective memories of the war and the colonial era. And I've tried to assess the impact of this on the landscape of memory politics in post-colonial France. I had several aims in writing the book, which essentially sum up the contributions that I hoped it would make. So first of all, like Emma, I wanted to question the existing chronology of memories of the Algerian War, which traditionally divides this into two quite clear-cut periods. So on the one hand, you have an era of state-sponsored silence and forgetting, which apparently lasted until the 1990s. And during that time, the Algerian War, which had been very deeply divisive in France and also ultimately humiliating because it was lost at the end, this was a taboo subject. It wasn't really spoken about officially. It wasn't commemorated officially. And then this era of silence traditionally was seen to then give way to a period of remembering, where the war returned to public consciousness over the course of the 1990s. So I wanted to nuance this chronology a bit, and in particular to show that although the state certainly wasn't talking about the Algerian War prior to the late 1990s, plenty of other people were talking about it. And so I wanted to show that if you adopted a different lens, if you looked at the conflict, the memories of the conflict from the bottom up rather from the top down, and we turned our attention to the communities most directly affected by the conflict, communities like the Pieds Noirs and the Harki, then you've got a different picture in which the supposedly silent years of the pre-1990 era were in fact filled with different voices. And this wasn't about denying that the state played a role in shaping the commemorative context in France, but rather to acknowledge that the state wasn't the sole agent or point of reference that needed to be taken into consideration. And I also wanted through the book to show how interconnected the Pieds Noirs and Harki communities were, and how their actions were very much shaped by what the other group was doing, but also by what broader actors within France were doing or saying. And this was a way of trying to move beyond the sort of group-specific studies that had tended to dominate memory studies, and which were critiqued, I think, quite nicely by Alain Confino a number of years ago. And by showing that, in fact, there had been a continual presence of memory and commemorative activity within communities like the Pieds Noirs and the Harki since 1962, rather than just from the 1990s onwards, this enabled me to show how a particular kind of post-colonial civil society came to be established in France, and how the Pieds Noirs community in particular were quite instrumental in shaping this terrain. And finally, and again this connects quite nicely to both Emma and Sandrine, this allowed me to historicize the so-called memory wars phenomenon that's deemed to be plaguing France today, whereby different groups compete fiercely and sometimes even violently for control over the representation of the past in the public sphere. And I wanted to use my case studies to show that this process of contestation and negotiation that we're seeing today in relation to France's colonial past didn't simply appear suddenly in the 1990s from nowhere, but rather had this long prehistory that needed to be acknowledged in order to better understand the current situation. And in terms of the theoretical underpinnings of this, I'm much more of an empirical than a theory-driven historian. And I was struck by rereading my own introduction that there's a lot of theory of memory in there. So clearly I felt the need to show that I was well versed in this scholarship in my book. But actually the book is really primarily about highlighting what people do with memory, what agents do with memories, how they construct and process those. So it's about the multiple ways in which the Pieds-Noirs and Harki communities and the members of those communities developed and or engaged with available narratives about the past to construct communal identities and to negotiate a place for themselves and for their histories within French society and culture, and also tracing how those narratives and strategies changed over time in response to a variety of evolving contexts and also in response to the behaviour and actions of other agents connected to the Algerian War.
Great, thank you so much. So thank you so much to the three of you. I'm going to just raise a few questions that I found reading the three essays, and then maybe we can open it up, and if anybody wants to join in, raise your hand with the little icon or type me a question and I will read it. But yes, as I said, I think there's a lot of interesting overlaps and kind of between the three pieces, basically. So I'm gonna ask three general questions, and I have more specific questions for all of you. But the first is the general questions. So one of the first things that I wanted to think about with you was the kind of the specificity, both geographically of France and temporarily of this post-war period, which you've all sort of mentioned in your comments, and in the introduction. But in particular, so in some ways, the questions that you're all, the narratives that you're all writing are very much specific to French history, right? They have to do with a particular shadow of Vichy, but also the particular process of decolonization of Algeria. So in that way, it's a very French story. At the same time, it's also, I was struck by the fact that they were all transnational stories at the same time, right? So in Emma's case, that it goes through Spain and Chile and the USA and the stuff about the CIA, which was really fascinating, and Tunisia and Hungary. So the kind, how in some ways the internationalization of this particular memory war, plays out. In Sandrine's case, as you mentioned again in your remarks, but this was very obvious in the piece, the kind of the focus of the Pacific, right, and the Asia-US relationship, and how that kind of plays into the argument. And Claire, in your case, it was in your case, in some ways, you also mentioned the international context when you talked about potential comparisons with the situation of Yarki, and ultimately I think you say that it's not comparable to a lot of the other situations, but you do reference the case of Kenya, Rhodesia, Angola, Mozambique. So I was curious to hear you think about whether you're making a particular argument. I mean, what you see is specifically French here, what is transnational, and what is specifically also, how would you think about this post-war moment, this kind of, I love this idea, I think Claire, you mentioned this, and I think you were citing Robert Frank, but that France was one war behind. I hadn't heard this, but I love that, so this idea of the one war behind, is this something that gives this moment this particular structure, right? So that's the first question. The second question is something, again, you've all alluded to, but I would be really interested in hearing more about this, is this question of the theorization of memory, right? Because at the end of the day, you are all three historians, and there is actually, I was interested, Claire, that you described yourself as more of an empiricist historian, because Sandrine and Emma, I think, are self-described as, in the projects as intellectual historians. So I'm curious also to think about this difference between sort of, is there a particular treatment of intellectual history of memory here that would be different? And also, how does literary theory come in? Because the three of you mentioned Michael Rothberg, so it would be perhaps interesting to hear you flesh out what the objections or the problems are with that kind of theory. And you said some of this before, but is there a kind of use of memory in literature that, and obviously that you're finding objectionable, but at the same time, I guess the question is, did this historicization, did this historical process, this is more for Emma and Claire because you guys have actually finished the book, something is still struggling through it, but did this leave you with a kind of memory, with a kind of theory of memory, or in some ways, I mean, Emma, you're very clear about the fact that you say that the historicization of memory has led you to basically assert that presenting abstract concepts such as morality, dignity, or human rights as kind of self-evident or eternal is clearly just wrong, you know. But did you end up out of this project with a new theory of memory, right? Is there a theory of memory in this, or and I guess in Emma's case more specifically, but also for Sandrine, like, is there a kind of specific way of intellectual history way of treating this question that would be different from a more social history based approach? And finally, the last question that I thought was very interesting in all three papers was the role of gender and race in kind of complicating memory, right? And in understanding who can be a subject of memory and a subject of empathy. And so in Sandrine's work, I think, you know, it's very much, I mean, the question of gender is very much brought to the foreground, but Claire, you also mentioned the kind of how race intervenes in this with the different populations, right, with the Harkis and the Pieds Noirs, and obviously in Emma's paper, the fact that Jews were not considered the kind of, whether it's anti-Semitism or not, I'm not sure, but at least, you know, Jews certainly play a specific role in there. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. So let me see. So I don't know, there's a question. I'm wondering, do you want to say something about that and then we'll open it up, or what do you guys think? Or, yeah? If you have any pressing thoughts, and then if not, we can add some more things as we go along.
Great.
Let me see. Yeah, because then there's a question for Emma, but it's more specific. So let's try to think about the more general stuff, and then we'll get to the more specific questions. Emma, do you want to start on any of these points?
Sure. There's a lot here. So
if you want, you don't have to answer all of them.
Okay. Okay. So I mean, I guess I can take a stab at kind of the last question you asked, right? About gender and race, and how Jews fit into that. So I mean, I think part of the problem that the history of the CICRC raises here, it's a problem, you know, it's a more general historical problem with the construction of universals, but it's then who gets to be a universal subject, right? And so this comes up in the history of the CICRC over and over again, both in the construction of who can join the group, right, such that Jewish Holocaust survivors cannot. Jews who were deported as resistors are welcome, right, and I should be clear about that. None of them become leading members of the group, but there is someone in the French Commission who has that particular background. But Jews who were deported for their racial characteristics, for a couple of reasons, are barred from membership. And you know, that has to do with the immense kind of cultural prestige of the resistance in the post-war moment. Resistance credentials allows the group to launch what was intensely anti-communist kind of project, right? With this kind of guarantee that it was nevertheless not a fascist project because of the resistance credentials of members. And so people who were deported, whose deportation did not provide evidence of that kind of political commitment, you know, could not be included in the group. So that was one thing. The other thing was that Jews disrupted the comparison between the Nazi camps and the Soviet Gulag. You know, once you started talking about the Jewish experience in Birkenau, it didn't work so well to claim that the exact same thing that people had experienced during World War II was kind of happening again. And so, but this was an issue that came up again and again over the course of the group's life. It wasn't just sort of decided at the beginning and then they never talked about it again. And it was an open sore up to the group's death, with Rousset himself eventually coming around and saying, people who were deported as racial deportees had the same bodily experience of concentrationary suffering that we did, and that they should be permitted to join. And he was kind of pushing ahead with this project against ferocious opposition, particularly from the Dutch members of the commission, who were very unhappy about this. And so this was a live issue throughout the group's life. But it wasn't the only place that this question about universals came up. It came up over and over again regarding the group's authority to investigate in unfamiliar cultural contexts. And so there was a kind of crisis within the organization over first the Tunisian investigation and then the China investigation, with some members saying, look, we don't have any of the language skills, we don't have any of the context, we do not have the tools to apply our experience. Ultimately, having been in Buchenwald is not enough to judge what's going on in China. And other members saying, no, we have achieved a kind of universal epistemological authority through this experience of bodily suffering. So I mean, this was just a consistent issue. Gender, not in the same way. But, I think what's interesting to me is the ways in which universalisms could be deployed in different ways for different political reasons, right? So Rousset, who wanted to investigate in China, was constantly accusing members of the group who didn't want to investigate in China of being racist. Like they didn't care about Chinese people suffering, right? And then he acted very differently when the context at stake was one that that would have been more politically inconvenient for him, like non-communist countries. And so, throughout the project, I think I tried to be really wary of the ways in which all of these claims to universal authority were getting set up. 1 inch below the surface, there was other stuff going on. So I want to give other people a chance to talk.
Yeah, let me just, before I give, I turn it to Sandrine and Claire, let me just, I wanted to read also, there's one message, and then David wanted to put on someone who has a question, but there's a question for Emma, which maybe you can come back to in a second, Emma, like not right this second, but it's from Anne, and it says, how was the process of discovering the involvement of the CIA funding in the so I don't know how you say it the CICRC. How did that influence your understanding of the group, and how it should be analyzed in the context of Cold War politics? And then, David, do you want to bring in Claire Mayo, who also had a question?
Yes, I believe I'm on now.
Yes, hi. Welcome.
Yes, do you want them to answer those questions first? Or
well, why don't you add it, and then they can take on whatever, but
Excellent.
Please go ahead.
Yes, by way of introduction, my name is Claire Mayo at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I work in modern France and disaster studies. So my question draws from disaster studies and memory studies. My question is, to what extent do you see the state or associations making equivalencies between experiences of survivors from these wars? In particular, I'm thinking of a line from Sandrine's article, where the little Tendu of Nevers is implicitly made a victim in juxtaposition to Hiroshima's survivors, which I find that to be fascinating, but there has to be a political component to that. So I was wondering to what extent you saw that in your own research. Thank you.
Sandrine, do you want to take that, and then also perhaps address whatever else you want from the general stuff?
Yes, thank you, Claire. I'll use your question to get at some of the issues you raised, Camille. And indeed, I'm still, unlike Claire and Emma, I'm still thinking through certainly what I've read and what I found in the archives, and teasing out the kinds of questions and debates that unfolded. On the question of war and violence and what is specifically French, the obvious is, of course, that particular French political discourse of Republican universalism and the place that Algeria had within the empire. So those particular specificity, I think, motivates all of our all of our work. But at the same time, the transnational question, I think, is both a methodological one and one that emerges from our very object of study. So the writers I look at that were themselves invoked memory and experience and suffering were themselves embedded in analogies, comparisons, and mapping out the political stakes of these invocations. If you think of the Cold War, if you think of Morin, who talks about Algeria, making comparison to Hungary, but especially sort of working out what the left is to do. Or to give another example, what does it mean to think of the 1962 Goncourt Prize being given to a Polish Jewish survivor whose account of Poland troubles precisely the ways in which a certain set of Polish communist intellectuals were being welcomed, or then to look at the admittedly failure of famous anti-colonial filmmaker Pontecorvo's 1959 film Capot on precisely a gendered Jewish experience of the camp that's clearly mapping out a communist political attachment. So in that sense, I think that emerges from the very texts we look at. But at the same time, a lot of the work that's being done in Pacific and Southeast Asian history around questions of war, complicity, memory in Korea, Japan, in fact, turns back to France as an example of another space and temporality where these very same questions are being worked through. So I think for us as historians, that's why the transnational is not just an object, but also has to be a methodological orientation, even as we do, and in my case, metropolitan French intellectual history, which allows me to think about your question where you were asking us about sort of what intellectual history might have to say in terms of literary theory. I think it's clear there needs to be a recognition of the ways literary theory engages text, notably through a question. I think Rothberg and others are interested in questions of redressability and human rights and justice, and how memory regimes can be productive for that. And I think for us historians, attentive to the complications and the contingencies of those, we're a bit more suspicious of turning to texts as exemplars of symptoms. For me, this means looking at literary or cinematographic texts and the ways in which they're being spoken, received in the press, and the general, both shape and are shaped in the political discourse of the period. So I think that there's an obvious theoretical orientation that's necessarily different. And I think it is because Rothberg's model has become so influential that in part we historians of the post-war need to engage it and to offer a different reflection. And I'll use that to abruptly shift to Claire's question, which echoes your question about gender. Part of why I think foregrounding the work of signification of gender and sexuality and making political meaning at that time is because I think it shows us how certain political questions get turned into moral ones, or how some complicated or ambivalent tensions remain at the heart of either anti-colonial arguments or arguments about the memory of the camps. So the analogy that's suggested in Hiroshima, Mon Amour, between the tondu, the little tondu of Nevers as a figure of innocence, to the women of Hiroshima I think is a problematic one, because what the film does, against its author's stated intentions, is precisely in the service of a universalization that wants to deny racism, in fact, reproduces race and centers a French experience at the expense of the very space and bodies it proclaims to memorialize. So only the French woman's memory stands in. And in fact, Hiroshima is not alone, because that's exactly how in those years the figure of the jeune fille functions in many of these literary and filmic texts. I'll stop here.
Thank you.
I know I've been a bit long-winded.
No, it's great. Claire, go ahead.
Okay, so I guess if we start with Claire's question, that's a useful way of thinking about specificity. Yes, I do think that, like Sandrine and Emma have said, there is something particularly French about this, but it is also transnational history. And certainly the groups that I look at are consciously and constantly looking outside of France and inside of France for models to compare themselves to, but also to borrow from. So, for example, there's a lot of reference to Vichy, to the recognition that Pied-Noir and Harki feel that the Jewish community have achieved by the late 1990s, and that is very much a model for what they're looking to gain. I think the Pied-Noir are quite interesting in terms of making equivalences. So in the 1960s, you see them looking around at other decolonial moments and movements and comparing their situation to that, but they also seek to make alliances with other groups that they feel have shared a similar experience. And for example, they reach out to the German ex-Berlins, the Vertriebenen, and they try to make alliances, even though it requires quite a bit of historical contortion to sort of see their experiences in the same frame. But that moment seems very brief, and then what you see from then on is a kind of competitive understanding of memory in which the Pied-Noir in particular measure their suffering against those of other groups and generally conclude that their suffering was at least as bad, if not worse, and that the French state is very keen to recognise the suffering of other groups but continues to ignore them. And I suppose that then inevitably brings us to Michael Rothberg and to literary theory. I suppose one of the things with Rothberg's idea of competitive or zero-sum memory is that he positions that as a bad kind of memory. And as a historian, I'm not really sure that that's a useful way to think about it. For me, it's more useful to think about why do the Pied-Noir set memory up as a competitive endeavour? What does it tell us about their experiences and what they're seeking to achieve? And also, I think with Rothberg, the individuals that he pulls out are not representative. You know, Hannah Arendt is an exceptional woman, but she's not your average Pied-Noir or Harki. And I think it's important to factor in how ordinary people process these experiences and to think about their role in this. And that can be, I'm not saying it's not valuable to look at specific individuals, but I think we also have to acknowledge that they're not representative, and we can't really generalize or universalize from those particular examples a wider societal experience. In terms of gender and race, I think these do factor in quite important ways. I think race is a very obvious one because it determines very much, first of all, actual experience. The Pied-Noir and the Harki are treated very differently by the French state, and that is very clearly bound up with the racial and religious otherness of the Harki, or perceived racial and religious otherness. But it also factors into changing perceptions of each community and the ways in which the Pied-Noir are able to very much dominate the landscape of post-colonial memory politics at first, but as understandings of colonialism change, as the composition of French society changes, as the kind of discourses around empire change, that you see the Pied-Noir being increasingly marginalized, decentered, and greater space and opportunity given to the voices of groups like the Harki, but also Algerians living and working in France and their descendants. And gender, I think, is particularly interesting and probably something I don't do enough with in the book, in that I think there are some really interesting ways in which the work of memory is quite gendered, and that women in both the Pied Noir and Harki communities end up taking on particular kinds of memory work. So if you look at the Harki community, for example, you have very much male figures engaged in political aspects of memory, and that's true as well of the Pied Noir. You know, they run campaigns for recognition, for compensation, and women tend to do the kind of mobilization of bringing together communities, about humanizing communities, bringing forward personal narratives. They work much more in the realms of literature and commemorative projects. And so I think there's quite an interesting gender dimension to the way that memory activism plays out.
So did you actually think that you had a kind of ended up with a theory of memory after writing this book? Or is it more like, or is it more sort of, you know, it's impossible to theorize as such, it's, you know, as a kind of concept? Was that sort of the conclusion, or did you, or were you more, or would you have revised it in a particular way? Do you see what I'm saying?
I think for me, there are a series of useful approaches to take in studying memory, but I don't want to kind of prejudge the conclusions by trying to fit them into a theory. So for me, the memory studies angle is useful as a series of approaches or different methodologies that can be pursued, but I don't then want to theorize the communities I'm looking at, because I think it's their complexity and their messiness, which doesn't fit within any established paradigm, that is what makes them interesting.
Yeah, really interesting. Emma, did you want to take on the question also about the CIA?
Sure. So these don't really have anything to do with each other, but I would like to add something about Rothberg and what historians can kind of bring to literary studies of memory, and then I'll answer the CIA question. Is that okay? So, I mean, Sandrine and Claire have raised some of the key points here, but the other thing that I just wanted to add that I think for me is difficult to accept as a historian in working with Rothberg's work. You know, I like many things about what he does, but I think that he tends to take his actors' claims about repetition in history at face value. And so, for example, he calls French violence in Algeria a copycatting of Nazi tactics by a nation recently victimized by fascism. And within a framework of French colonial history, that's just an enormously problematic thing to say. French violence in Algeria is not arising out of nowhere from this kind of previously innocent victim nation, right, that has suddenly decided to copy Nazi tactics. It has its own history. And it does not end up looking very much like the Nazi SS camps. Which is not to say that it is therefore grand, right? But it has its own genealogy. And so I think that Rothberg tends to miss that in places. He kind of listens to the text that he's reading, which are for strategic reasons, drawing those parallels. And he sort of assumes that here's the same thing happening over here in Algeria again. And so, you know, so in terms of the history that I'm telling, like precisely why the CICRC breaks down in its confrontation with violence in Algeria is because it does not look like the Nazi SS camps, because it is not history repeating itself. It is colonialism, in French colonialism in Algeria in action. And so, you know, so I think that one thing that historians can bring to the table in talking to literary scholars, not just Rothberg, of course, but all the people that Sandrine mentioned, Silverman, is a sense of the specificity of past violence, right? That these acts of violence have their own textures and their own histories, that it's not just all kind of concentration camps here and there and atrocity at large. So the CIA, okay. Discovering CIA's influence on the CICRC influenced my understanding of the group in all kinds of ways. It did not make me realize, aha, you know, this is an anti-communist group, right? I mean, that is very clear without knowledge of where the money is coming from. This is an anti-communist group. It starts as an attack on the Gulag that through a kind of contingent series of circumstances turns into a global effort. So, you know, so Tony Judd in Postwar suggests that kind of precisely because of that, we can just sort of say who cares to CIA funding. He says these people are all anti-communists anyway. They didn't need encouragement from the CIA. He's talking about the Congress for Cultural Freedom, not about my organization specifically. But he says, you know, what's the big deal? They were already anti-communists. And I do not take that line. I think that prevents us from getting into very interesting stuff about how claims to moral universality were part of a state-directed, right, violent Cold War project, and the language that my actors use, which is very much about kind of the power of individuals and ethics against partisanship and states and politics. We need to acknowledge every time we talk about that this was a CIA-funded project, right? So I think it matters very much. At the same time, right, I think the difficulty for me then as an intellectual historian was how not to then switch into just a kind of instrumentalist reading of all the rhetoric of my group, right? They're saying this because, you know, it aids their Cold War project. And one of the ways that I approach that structurally in the book is that I decided to have, the CICRC isn't founded until 1949, and I decided to have a first chapter that was set in essentially in 1945 and traced my actors' return from the camps. And the reason that I did that was largely because I wanted it to be clear to readers that ways in which they conceptualized their experiences of the war did not arise instrumentally out of a desire to bash the Soviet Union and draw parallels between the Nazi camps and the Soviet camps. That, you know, in fact, these were survivors who were processing their experiences in particular ways. So I have, you know, this whole first chapter that is about their testimony to the camps, kind of pointing out the ways in which some of the intellectual categories that they end up using for Cold War purposes do not at all arise out of that context in some kind of, you know, Peter Novick calls the Holocaust the wrong atrocity for the Cold War. And I think that that's a useful phrase, except in this way that it suggests that people kind of deliberately decided, right, that they were going to frame World War II's violence in a particular way. So that's one of the things that I've tried to steer clear of. But yeah, on a very practical level, the CIA involvement meant I had to go to a lot of American archives, which was not something that I had reckoned on doing. It was super interesting.
Great, thank you. Let's see. I think that, okay. Yeah, does anyone else want to jump in at this point? Sandrine, did you have anything to add to this stuff?
Not quite immediately, unless there's another question.
Okay, so Anne, we're waiting to see if Anne had a follow-up. But well, in the meantime, I could maybe ask a few questions. I was also, well, for Sandrine, actually, since you're on screen, I was curious about the role also of melodrama in the project and the aesthetic, and I wanted to see if you had some thoughts about it, because, for example, in some ways it's like, you know, why I mean the genre of the melodrama and why the melodrama to deal with these moments of trauma, right? So I wanted to see, yeah, and it's obviously not just in this particular moment in history. You know, you could think about Griffith or a lot of other theories, but I was wondering if you had some thoughts about this and sort of the relation between melodrama, gender, and trauma in this particular moment.
Well, and my thoughts are still in the making. What's very striking is that the way the term, as you said, melodrama or the genre of realism has always been evoked, and in fact is part and parcel of both the history of the novel and the history of film. But there are very particular ways in which it effectively allows certain political stories to be told that can both escape an explicit political discourse. I mean, let's not forget censorship in that period, certain moments silences. But also I think because melodrama relies on figures that have to do with the heterosexual couple, the love affair, they become especially amenable to the kinds of stories that are told where you can talk about violence and trauma. And violence and trauma around particular figures, other historians have noted how in the 50s and 60s, we see the figure of the jeune fille circulating everywhere, from Bardot. I talk in my book about from Bardot to Beauvoir, talking about Bardot, drawing a link with Boupacha, so the ways in which that does work, but also figures of fragile and vulnerable masculinity, which can appear on film and in literature. So it does a particular form of cultural labor that allows the political while depoliticizing. And one of the other questions I have right now is I am going through a number of films, and there are many more films than people assume that in fact allude gesture to the Algerian War or openly try and dramatize the Holocaust as a camp experience and as a Jewish camp experience. Is what does the language of realism allow in terms of telling the stories, but also essentially shape what cannot be said in terms of the complexities of complicity or speaking about the present without engaging in those complexity. One classic example, I've mentioned it and I'll stay there, is in fact the fact that no one seems to think about the ways in which Pontecorvo's Capot, made in 59, comes to France in 61 and is actually quite a popular success, borrowing from previous tropes at a time when Anne Frank is being put on stage in France, and in the wake of Hiroshima, Mon Amour. So thinking about the genre of the literary and visual text we work with, I think is essential to be able to tease out how the political functions.
Yeah, I mean, what struck me as interesting is it's also yet another way to kind of dehistoricize. I mean, you said depoliticize, but it's also dehistoricize, right? It's kind of presenting these universal tropes of like, there's always been like this, right? The love story, et cetera, which is in some ways analogous to some of the strategies that, for example, Emma picks up on in her, but it goes through like this rhetoric of human rights or the moral witness or whatever, but in some ways they're, so it's either the aesthetic or the political, but they end up producing a kind of similar effect.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe that's where the tension between a universalist rhetoric steeped in a very specific context and a tension between the work of morality and the work of politics that I think we're interested in, the three of us in different ways in that particular period.
Mm-hmm. David, I think you wanted to jump in too.
Yeah, as somebody who knows almost nothing about this topic, I had a bit broader question, but it was sparked by Claire's comment about being an empiricist and then realizing how much theory she had done. And I guess what I'm wondering is, how did each of you sort of grapple with? Did you think of this as starting from theory and moving into more empirical research? Did you start with empirical research that led you then to have to address theoretical ideas? How did that, in terms of bringing these projects together, and as you went through that process, how were you balancing sort of theory and the empirical side as you developed it?
Yeah. And very topical.
Who wants to go first?
I can give you a very practically orientated answer, in that I feel the way the British PhD is structured kind of shaped how I approached it. So in my first year, I spent the time going through the quite limited amount of secondary reading on the Pied-Noir and the Harki communities and the quite voluminous literature on the memories of the war, and that then led me into the theory. And then I spent my second year in France doing most of the empirical work, and then kind of my third year thinking about how those two things fitted together. So it was more like the way in which my time had to be structured sort of led me on this particular path. I guess is my answer to that question, which is maybe not the most rigorous, but...
I can go. So for me, I suppose I can do a bit of this kind of biographical bit too. This book is not my dissertation. It came out of one chapter of my dissertation. And then a couple of years after I finished graduate school, Patricia Lorsa and Todd Shepard asked me to give something to an edited volume that they were doing on French Mediterraneans. Kind of thought about what I could do with this. And I said, oh, well, when I was researching the dissertation, there was this other kind of Algeria stuff that was connected to these people that I've written about in this Cold War framework. And by the time I finished writing that piece, I thought, okay, like this is the book I have to write, which is not the dissertation. Because I saw faintly, and in ways that, that I now think are wrong, that these things had something to do with each other, right? That the histories that I was interested in about the post-war moment and the immediate post-war moment, and then how French people understood and misunderstood the violence of the Algerian War, that I could connect them through this story. I was really interested in the actors at the heart of this history. I engage with all this kind of big stuff in the book. And the title that it has ended up with has these giant proper nouns of like the resistance and the Cold War. But it is a story about one group of people, and I found those people really compelling and complicated. And they had largely been written about in pretty one-dimensional, heroicizing ways up to that point. And so that's kind of where the project came from for me. I didn't think of myself as a memory scholar per se. I was interested in aftermaths, but the project didn't start with kind of Michael Rothberg, like how can I respond to his work? The project started with a group of people whose story I felt in this inchoate way would let us see some interesting things about this moment and let me intervene in a number of conversations that I was interested in.
I guess I'll pick up from you, Emma. Well, actually, I'll pick up from the last remark you made. I think Claire and Emma would agree with me, but I don't want us to give the impression that we're writing in response to Rothberg.
No.
Yes, I mean that's what I thought. But I think for all of us, Rothberg started writing about these questions at the very moment in which we were unfolding our very projects. And I think it's interesting to think about why some questions emerge in literature in particular ways, and the temporality of that in relationship to the discipline of history. Because I always work with literature as both a field and an object, I'm always interested about those questions. But I think for us historians, it's about also engaging in these larger debate as to why has the Rothbergian model been so appealing, and what might it erase that I think both you and Claire and Emma have said. So I just wanted to put sort of a caveat there. And to return to your question, David, I really like the question because I think it poses very concretely how methodologically we craft a historical problem and ask a set of historical questions, whether because we find a group of actors or we're interested in tracing communities. For me, who works with gender and sex as the fundamental frame of analysis through which I see the political being shaped, gender is not just an object, it's also a mode of critique. So my work as a historian always means that, in fact, there is a simultaneous to use a word that I think we've all used, a simultaneous entanglement between what we might qualify as theory, whatever that is, and the empirical. That in fact, the work of the critical historians, and I know that's a conversation that's happening right now among us, is in fact to be able to denaturalize assumptions, to ask a different set of questions without flattening, erasing, and to be able to be attentive to contingency and to the ways in which we have to resist linear genealogy or tautologies in our work, and I think that's why an interrogation of the post-war as a general rubric infuses all of our work, it seems. Although, you know, I'll have to be more modest since I have not finished the book yet. And just to conclude, since I'm interested in the relationship of the aesthetic and the political, thinking through what the work of discourse representation or aesthetic production is embedded in my empirical practice of looking at aesthetic text to say something of the political.
Interesting, because in some ways David's question also makes me think of that it's also foregrounds the problem of transference, right? Which I think in Emma's pieces is really explicit at the end. And I know who your advisor is, Emma, because he was my advisor and he's obsessed with transference. But they're really at the end of your piece, I was very struck by this sort of staging of yourself in the project also, right? Of kind of putting into words your own involvement in this.
Well, and it's really interesting you asked about that paragraph. Sandrine does not like that paragraph, and I had a lot of agony about keeping it in or not. In the end, I tried to make it better, Sandrine, I promise. But I did keep it in because I don't think I'm the only one who has processes of transference with my materials. I continue to get a number of really forceful responses from people when I presented this stuff at conferences. It's difficult to talk about, to offer critique, right, in the direction of someone who was just reburied in the Pantheon. And this material elicits strong feelings in people. And I think that was behind my kind of apologetic note earlier when I said, like, look, I'm not happy that memory doesn't do all this good stuff that you all wish it did. But I felt like I needed to be explicit with readers ultimately, because I was being misread in various ways, right? I was being read as attacking these actors, right? That I was just kind of engaging with, say, Tony Judd by doing a kind of reversal, right? And saying, no, these are the bad guys. They were just CIA stooges. Or I was being read as continuing this kind of laudatory work around them. And so I'm sure a lot of the reasons that I was being misread is because I was working out my feelings about these actors on paper in ways that I didn't always have full control over. And so I was really grateful for readers like Sandrine who were able to flag some of those things for me.
For example, that Claire, you must have had similar reactions when you presented your work, right?
I was thinking I actually come at it from the opposite direction. So I guess particularly with the Pied Noir, I was conscious that I was looking at a group that historians really hadn't interested themselves in, that most of the scholarship about the community was produced by members of that community. And so one of the things that I wanted to do with my study was to show the ways in which the Pied Noir are legitimate objects of historical inquiry, and that they're not simply to be dismissed as sort of to caricature them far-right nostalgics for empire, but to do that in a way that doesn't legitimate the discourses that they're promoting. And so I was also very conscious of the need to be very clear about the distance between myself and the groups that I was studying. And I feel that, like you, it took time. And actually, somebody was telling me that they taught some of my earlier published stuff in a graduate seminar, and one of the graduate students had commented that I was very negative towards the pied noir. And my colleague who told me the story said, I feel like that's disappeared a bit from your book. So I feel like I did, over time, work out how to handle that, but it certainly wasn't easy. And I do think, I would also build on Emma's point that for me, the people were always the really interesting part of this, and you do get really caught up in their lives and in their narratives. And so, yes, it's kind of, it's difficult, I guess.
Yeah, but it's good because in some ways it also shows how these, in some ways, you know, if even though we want to shy away from universals about memory, it does seem we could say that at least if you're working on the question of memory, especially in something like the post-war France, you have to sort of take into account your own, I mean, it highlights the question of transference, even though, as you guys say, all historians have transference with their material, of course, but this really brings it to the forefront, I think, or something like that.
I think that's true.
Well, do you have, I wanted to give you the opportunity to share any last thoughts if you wanted to. We're almost out of time, but if you have any concluding remarks, please. Otherwise, if you wanted to return to anything. Yeah.
I guess, sorry, no.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think what struck me particularly in all of this is the question of who has the right to speak about the past and who gets to speak about the past in what context and how that changes over time. Yeah. And also the sort of, this idea, the kind of tension we've talked about throughout between universalizing discourses and ambitions and very particularist specific realities that we're all looking at. I guess those were the things that really sort of struck me as kind of nice connections between all the papers.
Yeah, it's great. Sandrine, did you want to, were you able to say something?
I was thinking about what you've both said, Emma and Claire, about transference and how striking it is that working on this moment is effectively so charged still, unsurprisingly, and how difficult it is still to move out of Cold War narratives and heroic versus complicit and really moral binaries that still organize our political reading of this period, which is why I think for some of us it's so urgent to do this work. And there's a number of historians working, interestingly, I think, bypassing or problematizing the question of memory, but that it is it's an effectively charged labor, not just in terms of our actors, but in the ways in which it echoes and reverberates in this moment. And my only experience of what you've both had to do is offering a critique of Hiroshima, Mon Amour, and just being told that what I had done was sacrilegious, that this was just an exemplary text. But how do we as historians talk about ambivalence and tensions? To me, that's a question that I think is interesting, and but whether it's Pied Noir, Harquet, or the CICRC.
I'm so glad that you said that. I mean, I think that, you know, this kind of paradigm of reading this moment in the sorts of categories that Tony Judd has given us, right, of the bearers of the burden of responsibility, and then the irresponsible revolutionaries, that continues to reverberate. And even when one's goal is to reject that binary, right, and to insist that there are more interesting things to do with post-war intellectual history than to decide who the good guys are or the bad guys are, our impulse is so much towards this morality play reading that people still try to sort of slot the work in, right? Like, okay, so you're saying they're bad, right? And so I'm really glad that you raised that in closing. The only thing that I would add, Camille, and this comes back to kind of the first question that you raised about the specificity of the post-war period, right? And I mean, certainly part of that is that so much of the general literature on memory and trauma and aftermaths is actually about this moment. You know, so the theoretical literature gestures towards this, but for me, some of the historiographic interest of the immediate post-war years is how consistently across different fields it gets figured as a before to the human rights revolution, a before to the second wave of humanitarianism, a before to Holocaust consciousness, a before to the ethical turn, right? And so I think as all of us have sort of drawn out, you know, another maybe universal in memory studies is a suspicion of discourses about silence or absence, that odds are something else is going on there. And so that is one of the things that has really kind of drawn me to this moment, because it so often gets cast in those terms.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for a really wonderful conversation. And I want to just alert our viewers and readers that Claire's book is out. So From Empire to Exile, History and Memory Within the Pied Noir Anarchy Communities. Emma's is about to come out, Political Survivors, the Resistance, the Cold War, New York noise, and the Fight Against Concentration Camps after 1945. And Sandrine's book is in progress, but I am so excited to read it. And again, the title, well, it's still in progress, right, Sandrine? But The Horror of History, Violence, Exile, and Gender in Cold War France. So thank you again for participating in this, and I'm really excited to read all three books when they come out.
Thanks, Camille.
Bye.
Thanks, David. Bye.